Thank you, Nicholas. I just do need to say that Ben Mercer was due to be here from Ancestry. He's unwell. He was here yesterday, and I didn't think he'd be here today either, really. He just did not look very well. And he's trying to get himself fit and well for tomorrow. So he and I had sorted out what we might do, and very fortuitously, I left on the PowerPoints some of the information that Ben was going to do. And as I go through, I'll tell you the pieces that I have not given attention to because that was what Ben was going to do. But we may well be able to, with all of the people here, fill in those gaps. I also need to acknowledge that the license to Ancestry goes back some way. We've been talking about this for some time. We were talking about it when Michelle was president, and it takes a long time to look at all of these processes. And I even had an email this morning from another large international organisation saying, could we license the content? We'd love to have that. So that you're always getting inquiries and people coming, and that you've got to be just so careful and just make sure what you do and what's best for the organisation. And we had for a long time members saying, I wish we could get these records online, because so many people are not able to either use the research services at Panmure or to get into the office to the NZSG library to look at some of these records. The other thing I want to mention before I start is that all of the presentations this week will be available in various forms. Some have been filmed, and they will go up on YouTube. That will take some time for some of them to get up there because of the processes that we need to go through. But we will be putting out some information to tell you which ones will be on YouTube. They will all be up on the website as a PDF. They will also be available as PowerPoint, so people who want to use them to show to a small group or whatever. We are working on a script to go with those, because as you know, when people give a PowerPoint, they talk about a lot of other things too. So we will try and have a script to go with that. And then people who just want some notes, we will have the notes, so that they will be available for people who've not been able to get here but want to know about what has been included. And we've been working on getting material up on the website for some time. Again, it just takes time. And in addition, we're very aware that not everybody has the broadband to look at YouTube. Not everybody has the broadband or the ability. They don't have a PowerPoint program. So you have to use every possible way that you can get the information out there, and that's what we're going to do. So without further ado, I'll look at this presentation. It is on. Yes. It's on. Yeah, it is on. It says it's on. All this works beautifully, doesn't it? When it works, it's all great. Yeah, the green was on. Would you like to just hit? Thank you very much indeed. That's not a problem. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 1918-1919 pandemic, and I'll talk about the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic a little later on. Now that's good. So we're going to talk about influenza, frequently complicated by pneumonia. And you'll be well aware that many of the people who died had influenza and it went on to develop pneumonia, and so their cause of death may either be influenza or it may be pneumonia on their death certificate. And this just gives us some information about what you should do. So let's have the next one here. So let's look at what happened worldwide. This influenza epidemic killed more people than the Great War. It killed between 20 and 30 million people, and some books will even say up to 50 million people. And as genealogists, we know that books differ. You can't believe the written word. You have to use a number of sources. So you'll look at one book and it'll say 20 to 30 million, another will say up to 50, and you take your choice. It was the most devastating pandemic in world history, and recorded history, I should say, because when you actually look at some of the historical things, you know that things happened in BC time that, of course, people didn't understand the cause of disease and so on, and might not have said. 1/5 of the world's population was infected. Now, that's really hard to even think. And it was most deadly for those aged between 20 and 40. And that is very unusual. If you look at the epidemiology of influenza, it usually hits those very vulnerable, the babies and the young and the old. But this particular pandemic, hit the young and hit particularly young men. Okay, thank you. When did it begin? Well, people say that it began early in 1918. And there's some quite interesting stories about in America, in Kansas, and in some of the camps, the flu epidemic started, influenza started. And in March, in Camp Funston, which is in Kansas, thousands of soldiers were affected. And as you'll see as we go through, it's when people are crowded together that the disorder spreads so easily. In fact, I was reading somewhere where it talked about one particle out of millions that come out your mouth when you cough or breathe is enough if it can jump from me to you, and you're done. So the US soldiers actually spread influenza to France. They travelled over to France, and France then began to spread through the French army, through Europe, and the British army. So we've started in January, February in the US, March in Kansas, then off they went to France, the French army in April, British army May to July, and then gradually spread all around the globe. Okay, thank you. Now we need to talk just a little bit about what influenza is. Influenza is a viral infection. So it's not a bacteria, it's a virus, and therefore it doesn't respond to antibiotics. Antibiotics are useful for secondary infections, but they don't work on the virus. And it affects the respiratory tract. So it affects your throat, your larynx, down into the lungs, and then affects the way that you're able to breathe. And Hippocrates, that father of medicine that we talk about, he talked about influenza in BC times. He didn't call it influenza, but he talked and described the symptoms that we will now know as influenza. The virus is very, very tiny, and because of that, it's got exceptional reproductive versatility. It's able to do all manner of changes. And that's why, as we'll see a bit later on, most of you talk to people about having their flu shot year after year because the virus changes. And what was the virus last year is different from the virus that will be in our winter here this year. It's often confused with the common cold, but it does make you feel a lot more sick when you have influenza. You can't just snuffle around and get about. You really feel pretty rotten. And as I mentioned earlier, pneumonia is the major complication of influenza, and that's what happened to a lot of these people. Thank you. So let's talk about the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic. The key difference is one of scale and one of location. So when you talk about a pandemic, it's where the same disease affects at the same time many countries throughout the world. So you wouldn't call, for example, Ebola a pandemic. It's an epidemic in West Africa because it's not around the whole world. An epidemic is when a disease affects many people at the same time in a community or an institution or a country. So you might say, look, we had an epidemic in Auckland Hospital of MRSA disease or something, because it's just at that particular time and it hasn't spread all around everywhere else. So what was the cause of this pandemic? It's yet another example that genealogists are so familiar with. Nobody really knows. Everyone's got an idea. Everybody's got a theory. And as things work through, the theories change, and as we know a little bit more about microbiology and epidemiology, we get a new theory. So firstly, was it from the unprecedented numbers of young men who were brought together by the war? Was it linked to troop ships and army camps and the widespread travel of some of these people? Was it linked to crowds celebrating the end of the war? And you'll see when we talk about New Zealand and Armistice Day, what a disaster it was that we didn't have good quarantine in place at that time. Some more here. Was there a link to China? And in fact, some of the modern epidemiologists suggest that it could have actually originated in China, just as bird flu and some of the other Asian flus have, because there were some boats that came from China across to Europe and the States. So there is a possibility. Was it an antigenic drift or an antigenic shift? And these are interesting terms. You'll see a little picture at the top where you've got a virus and it's shifting. The top arrow is antigenic drift and the bottom arrow is antigenic shift. So when you talk about that, the drift, as if you think, one of the writers I've seen talking about antigenic drift says, think about being in a sailboat and you drift along. It's slow, it's gentle, but it happens, you get there. So an antigenic drift is gradual and subtle variations in the evolution of the virus. And that's why we need the flu shot year after year, because it's a subtle change and next year it's different. But antigenic shift, and this guy said, think about yourself in a car and you tap the gear shift and vroom, off you go. So that antigenic shift is a sudden and major change. And the genetic makeup of the virus is resorted, and you actually get a new combination, and it can really be quite a nasty virus. Thank you. So in New Zealand, the Royal Commission of Inquiry after the event made these comments. It said that the cause was a virulent new infection introduced from overseas. Well, absolutely. It didn't just start in New Zealand, it had to come here from somewhere. They also found that the health department was unprepared. And if you read Black November, which is this really excellent and interesting book by Jeffrey Rice, he wrote it in 1980s and he renewed it. It's a new print in 2005. And the the stories of how the health department ignored information, especially from Auckland, sent down to Wellington. They didn't believe what they said. They didn't say, okay, we've got to do something about stopping travel. It just didn't happen. They had never had anything like this happen and didn't really know what to do. The other thing was that quarantine restrictions were casual and they were unsatisfactory. Australia is a different story, and I'm sorry Ben's not here to tell you about that, because they did put in some good quarantine, quarantine measures, and actually stopped a lot of the travel and a lot of the spread. And what happened as a result of this was a major reorganisation of health administration. And that was probably the best thing that happened. It's sad when these things happen, and you have to wait for something like that to happen to get things fixed. But that was the major thing that happened here. So why was it called Black Death? And this is really an interesting thing. When your lungs are damaged and you can't get the cells don't work properly, and you get blood and fluid where you normally would be able to get oxygen and breathe properly, oxygen exchange is reduced. And the skin, therefore, if you don't have enough oxygen, you hear people going blue, say, oh, he went blue, or whatever. So that blue change of colour is called cyanosis. And so if people don't get their normal colour, we go a dusky kind of a purple. And this discoloration is an ominous sign about the fact that this person is actually not able to get sufficient oxygen. And we didn't understand about vital capacity. We didn't understand about how exchange of oxygen took what we needed to do, and we certainly didn't have anything that was able to reduce this. And so you hear stories of people who would say, okay, if once the person started to change colour, you knew that a couple of days they'd be dead. There was nothing that was done. Thank you. I love this young nun's story. The nun was told to sit by a dying man. I'm sorry, you can't see this so well. She thought he was breathing normally, and he was a big, strong, healthy young man, as many of these people were. And then quite suddenly he gave a great gulp, and before her very eyes, she's described as saying, he turned jet black, not blue or purple, but black like a Negro. And so the Black Death came from that lack of oxygen because of the inflammation in the lungs that stopped the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide occurring. Just before I talk to this, it's fine to have that there. The other term that you sometimes hear, of course, is the Spanish flu. It didn't originate in Spain, but apparently the Spanish King Alfonso died of influenza in May of 1918. And someone sort of then just said, oh, well, Spanish flu, and it kind of became a name. Okay, so let's look at New Zealand life in November of 1918. Ordinary life really became impossible. You found that shops and offices and factories shut down. And they shut down not necessarily because the health department went along and said, shut your doors and stop everybody coming in. Why do you think they stopped? Because people were so sick, you didn't have anybody there. You didn't have people to open the shop. You didn't have people to work the factory, and schools, the teachers were ill. So the whole of the places around, schools, hotels, theatres closed. Shipping came to a halt. Quite a lot of ships were unable to go from one port to another. So supplies became short. And you found people saying, well, they ran out of flour, or they ran out of salt, or the basic things that they needed. And there was huge pressure on hospitals. And as you would probably understand, quite a number of doctors and nurses died, no matter how careful they were in their trying to avoid cross-infection. The virulence of the virus was just so bad and so powerful. Okay, so let's have a look at the number of deaths. I am using the figures from Black November. So I'm saying that's the source I'm using for the figures. If you go on and look at New Zealand history and ARA, if you go to various other, the figures will be slightly different. And in fact, Jeff Rice says, nobody really knows because they didn't keep good records. People died here, and it must be like it was in Ebola when people died and they were quickly buried or moved to a place. Who keeps the record? Who says, stop, let me count and tick this person off before they take them to wherever they were going to go? So the figure that Jeff comes up with is 8,573 people died in New Zealand of influenza. In the North Island, over 4,000, and in the South Island, 2,000. And there was a very high level of Maori deaths. And I think that's often not acknowledged. And I have a slide a bit later that gives you a little bit more information about the Maori deaths, but they were totally unprepared and nobody kind of went out and said, hey, this is a disorder here. They didn't trust Pākehā medicine. They didn't trust what was happening, so why would they take any notice? And they used their tauangas and people to say, this is what you ought to do. Thank you. So I've then chosen to just go down the country and talk a little bit about each area. In Auckland, there are quite a number of things to talk about, and I've put the map there because I know that there will be some people in Australia that are going to be looking at this and they mightn't know where Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin are. So, Auckland, one of the things that was interesting was the tales about the ship Niagara. Now, the ship Niagara had a large number of people on it. It had some important New Zealanders that people... The theory kind of went that, okay, it came on the Niagara, they didn't quarantine it because they didn't want these important people to be held up in their work, the government people. But the majority of writers now say that that's not the case, that it was here before the Niagara came. It didn't help, but it didn't start it. We talked about in Auckland the enormous volunteer effort. The people from the Red Cross, from St John's Ambulance, Army Medical Corps, they were out there in full. And Jeff Rice says, I wonder how that will work today. I wonder if we will have enough volunteers if this should happen again, or whether people will just kind of hunker down. So it's interesting. Auckland Hospital was absolutely overcrowded, as many hospitals were throughout the country. And Victoria Park was set up as a temporary morgue, and it had bodies that were bagged, labelled, and then they were going to be taken out by train, by cart, by ambulance, mainly out to Wellington Cemetery. There are a lot of rumours about the fact that other places were morgues too, but most say that it was Victoria Park, it wasn't other places, but people would say, I saw the ambulance go by, or I saw whatever, and so they must have been there in the middle of the night and didn't want to tell us. And temporary influenza hospitals opened, and they were sometimes the large homes or schools that had been closed. Sir John Logan Campbell, one of his residences was used so that they could be used as a safe place for influenza victims to be cared for. And Auckland had the largest death toll, 1,128 people. And that wasn't because it was the biggest place, it was because it started there. Quarantine measures were not taken note of. And so it just spread without anybody really being careful. Waikamete Cemetery, and I'll get Nicholas and maybe Diane to talk about that later on, because that was one of the things that Ben was going to do, so I kind of left it. But Waikamete Cemetery became a major area, and there are lots of stories about they all got put in a mass grave. Well, that's balderdash. When you go out there, you see they're carefully named and carefully identified, but stories, just myth and allegations all the time. Genealogists are wonderful at myths and allegations. And this is just a memorial to the victims of the 1918 influenza epidemic, and it's there on a field. Thank you. In Thames, there's a memorial to a nurse. This reads, this plot was enclosed and the tablet erected by the people of Thames in grateful remembrance of Sister Jessie E. Linton, formerly of Thames Hospital, after untiring devotion to duty during the epidemic of 1918. She fell a victim and died the 18th of November 1918, aged 30 years, in the service of humanity. And I can't read the bottom line. All over the country, there are little plaques, little places where people are thankful and grateful to the efforts of doctors, nurses, ambulance people, politicians, firemen, all sorts, ambulance drivers, all sorts. Thank you. And this is an interesting comment by Ida Riley, and Jeff Rice's book is full of little stories of people, the little anecdotes that he's got from papers and various other places. And she says, as if by magic, Queen Street, this is Armistice Day, as if by magic, Queen Street just filled with people. It was one mass of laughing, crying, coughing, and obviously sick people. Was it really the armistice, or was it just a chance to get out of the house, even if I die? Just let me see and hear people's voices again. The feeling of elation on the air that morning was just marvellous. Now, this is an example of this should never have been allowed to happen. It's like people, when we have a mild epidemic and people say, don't go to the theatre, don't go to the cinema. And in a couple of places, the people were asked not to gather, but they took no notice. And it's an interesting thought about, I've been stuck in my house for a week. The war has ended. I want to go out there and go Yahoo. And so people then would do that. Wellington, there was significant delay in preparing for the epidemic in Wellington, and it was mainly due to political wrangling between the Minister of Health and the Wellington Mayor. Now, most of the mayors in these areas were actually more aware of what they should do in relation to quarantine, in relation to restricting movement, than the Ministry of Health was. The Ministry of Health just was a flop over this event. And it led to Wellington having the highest city death rate of our four major cities. And there was also an acute shortage of doctors and volunteer helpers. Thank you. And this is just a picture which tells its own story. On your right, a pile of ambulances outside the town hall waiting to be instructed where to go to pick up the dead. And just a picture of the ambulance of the day, which I thought you might like to see. Karori Cemetery in Wellington is where a lot of the people are buried who died in the epidemic. And apparently the city council workmen dug long trenches to cope with the extraordinary mortality. So instead of a single plot, there were trenches, and then the coffins would be put in one after the other. But each burial was separately marked and recorded. And there were only 2 cremations as opposed to hundreds of burials, because this was when cremations weren't common. And Cedric, you might be able to tell us when cremations started, but at that time apparently you had to specify in your will that you were okay to be cremated, so that was quite interesting. Then in Christchurch, Lynwood Cemetery filled so rapidly, and that's a picture of Lynwood Cemetery up the top after the earthquake, and a lot of the broken headstones sitting down there waiting to be pulled back together again. But fortunately, the NZSG had recorded and transcribed the Lynwood Cemetery. Yes. So it filled so rapidly it had to be closed, and a new cemetery developed. And the peak mortality in Christchurch was the 19th of November, and there were 48 deaths. Dunedin had the least severe epidemic of our 4 cities, and many unmarked flu epidemic graves are found in Andersons Bay Cemetery. And the peak mortality on the 26th of November, so you can see it go down, and 18th in Christchurch, and then 26th in Dunedin, 16 deaths. And one of the awful stories was about landlords who would evict tenants when they developed the flu. I don't know what they thought they were going to do or where they might go, but they didn't want them in their place. And then you wonder now, well, how did they clean it up? Did they know actually what to do before they got another tenant who didn't appear to have the flu, or what? This is Andersons Bay Cemetery, beautiful spot. Yes, Dunedin, yes. Okay. Interesting Maori death rates. Maori were 7 times more likely than Europeans to die from the flu, and the Maori settlements were totally unprepared. So as a result of that, over a short period of time after that, Maori and Pākehā relationships were not in a good space. But at that time, we had Maui Palmieri, who was MP for Western Maori and Minister of Maori Affairs, and he played a really significant role in making sure that the Maori became aware, and he went round from place to place, marae to marae, and he tried to help Maori understand what they needed to do. And this was also fascinating. Tahu Potiki Wiramu Ratana began his healing missionary during this epidemic. He apparently had a vision of what he ought to do in order to support his people, and the Ratana movement started as a result of his experience in the epidemic. Then my last slide starts off with Sevilla. And Sevilla is French for remember. And I put it there because I travel to France a lot, and I went to an area where the Germans had been through when they were retreating and had killed 680 people in this particular village, which is called Oradour-sur-Glane. And the village is left exactly as it was. So you see prams and cars and all sorts. And then they have a memorial underneath that you walk through, and it tells you the story. But the big thing on the gates as you come in is this huge big word, Souviens, remember. And that, of course, is what we have to do, because in 2 months, New Zealand lost about half as many people to influenza as we lost during the whole of the First World War. No event has killed so many New Zealanders in such a short time. And while nearly every New Zealand town has a First World War memorial, there are scarcely any public monuments to the victims of the worst modern disease disaster. And some of the writers suggest, when these things happen, you overcome it, then you forget it. So you will find unless you find a plaque like I showed you earlier, it really is a problem to try and help us remember. And I wonder if in 2018 we will be doing something to just remember, because in the Featherston Public Cemetery, it's very distressing. You look here, row F, Private McClellan, 16th of November. Private Alexander, 15th of November. Orchiston, 16th of November. Kemp, 15th of November. Wilderbourne, 15th of November. Age 25, 28, 33, 29. And so on it goes, page after page of these guys in the Featherston military camp who didn't die of the war. They came back from the war and they died of influenza and pneumonia. And you know, you just look at it and you just go down 21, 31, 25, 20. And what you see in the row is there in date order. So you can see, you know, if I go back a few pages, it was on the 12th of November, blah, 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 blah. Then the 13th or the 14th of November, then the 15th and 16th. So that you've got this record of an event just laid out there in front of you by just looking at a cemetery. And it's a pretty interesting, devastating story. And if you go online and just put in Google the 1918 pandemic or epidemic, whatever word you like to use, although it is a pandemic, you will find the most interesting stories, the most interesting background to this dreadful, dreadful event. And I do recommend to you, if you have any interest, Jeffrey Rice's book. Black November is the title of the book. And I just thought there were 2 or 3 things in here that you might be interested in. The publisher, very cleverly, has put on the inside cover death notices, and they're all the death notices, and you read one, it says, you know, died of influenza, aged 19 years, etc., as you go down. There's a piece where a gentleman talks about his life in Wellington, and he says, "We were so busy that we lost count of the dead from one day to the next, but we occasionally took a breather and stepped outside for a short walk, and I can testify that I stood in the middle of Wellington City at 2 o'clock on a weekday afternoon, and there was not a soul to be seen. No trams running, no shops open, and the only traffic was a van with a white sheet tied to the side with a big red cross painted on it, serving as an ambulance or hearse. It really was a city of the dead." And those are the sorts of things that you see. And then this is an interesting graph he's done showing the distribution of the influenza duration and peaks. So it's starting, thanks Nicholas, starting in October and then going through to December. It was very short-lived, 2 months really, and then it just died out. So maybe changes to the virus or who knows, but it just stopped. So it's a very, very interesting story, a very sad story, but one that as New Zealanders we ought to know a little more about perhaps than we do. Thank you. So I'm very happy to answer any questions, but I wonder if, Diane, would you like to just make a little chat about the Waikamete Cemetery, because you and Nicholas and Ben went out there the other day. All right, Nicholas, you're passing the buck here, Nicholas. There you go.
You stay up here, go. I think it's just a conversation about, we're in this 4-year period of remembering World War One, and Diane and Ben Mercer and myself went out there, and we met Kath from the Friends of Waikumete, and I've also had a conversation with Audrey, who met me out there a few days ago as well. So I think the big question, I think, is how are we going to remember the centenary, which is now only 3 years away. And I know that Ancestry are quite keen to work with the New Zealand Society of Genealogists and other organisations in coming up with an accurate list of those who died and where they're buried throughout the country. And I think, push to try and rectify what you identified, Gay, is that, we have lots of war memorials, but actually very few flu memorials, despite that huge number of fatalities. So that's something that I think Ancestry will look to make an announcement this year about working to come up with something that's a bit more fitting to remember this disaster. Yeah, that's all I have.
I'd just like to say one thing. It was very interesting when we were out at Waikumete.
Come up here, Diane.
I've lost what day it was, quite recently. The days seem to have been quite busy. That where Kathy was explaining that the total myth and allegation of where this large memorial is, and you see this wonderful swathe of land. Some people say all the flu victims are buried there. Kathy says, no, that's not true. They're buried and they're scattered throughout. And if you look at the cemetery and walk the rows, you walk the walk, you will see the burials in various places. So it will be interesting, and it would be really worthwhile if we could blow apart some of the myths and allegations about trenches and mass burials and things like that, which obviously aren't right.
If I could just add, actually, Waikumete, as you know, I'm sure most of you have been to Waikumete, it's an extraordinary piece of land, isn't it? It's a huge cemetery. I mean, it must be the biggest cemetery in New Zealand. Must be, I'm assuming. Well, there you go. So, and of course, it was there. It was there because the train line was there at what is now the Gleneden train station. But one thing that strikes me about Waikumete, there's a huge RSA presence there, as you know, quite rightly so. But there's just that little memorial, which it's way up what is now way up the back of the cemetery, and yet there's 1,000 people in that cemetery who died of the flu pandemic, and very little to remember them.